Congress is back in Washington, and once again, the federal government is staring straight at a shutdown cliff. This time with the January 30th deadline that's already packed with more political explosives than usual. Here's the reality. Large portions of the federal government are only funded through the end of January. Now, if Congress does not pass either new full-year funding bills or another temporary extension, a partial government shutdown automatically kicks in. There's no drama switch to flip, no discretion. The clock simply runs out. This is happening less than 2 months after lawmakers finally ended the longest shutdown in U.S. history, a 43-day stalemate that stretched from October into November. That shutdown bruised markets, disrupted services, and reminded everyone how fragile normal operations actually are. So why are we right back here again? Well, because Congress only solved part of the problem. You see, back in November, lawmakers passed a mix of full-year funding bills and a short-term patch. Some agencies are funded through September, most are not. The rest were punted to January, which is how we ended up staring at another deadline instead of, a real solution. Since returning negotiators have announced what they're calling progress, Republican and Democratic appropriators agreed on top-line spending numbers just before Christmas. And this week, lawmakers released the text of 3 bill funding packages, a so-called minibus covering areas like the Justice Department, energy and water projects, and interior and environmental programs. And that sounds constructive, and it is, technically, but let's zoom out here. There are still 9 major funding bills that haven't passed either chamber. The Senate still requires bipartisan cooperation to move quickly, and the House is operating with one of the thinnest majorities in modern history. That combination is dangerous because it means any small group of lawmakers can stall the entire process if they believe leverage is on their side. And leverage is exactly what this moment is all about. You see, funding is no longer the only issue on the table. It's just the most convenient pressure point. Healthcare is one of the biggest landmines here. Enhanced Affordable Care Act premium tax credits expired at the end of last year, raising insurance costs for millions of Americans. Democrats want a clean extension. Some moderate Republicans want reforms attached. Others want nothing to do with it at all. Now, that fight is bleeding directly into the funding debate here. Moderate House Republicans have already joined Democrats to push for a forced vote. Leadership says the issue is inevitable, and everyone involved knows that attaching healthcare to funding either accelerates compromise or detonates it. Then, of course, there's the Epstein files. What happened to the Epstein files? Well, Congress passed a law requiring the Justice Department to release them by December 19th. That deadline came and went. The DOJ says it's releasing documents in batches due to volume and redactions, but lawmakers from both parties, well, they're not buying it. There are now threats of contempt votes against the Attorney General. There are resolutions being drafted to force compliance, and Senate leaders are preparing votes that would escalate the confrontation. Now that matters because funding deadlines are where unresolved fights go to get weaponized. And then you add in foreign policy. The administration recently escalated military action involving Venezuela, including strikes and the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Now, Congress was not notified in advance, and lawmakers are now openly questioning whether the president exceeded constitutional authority. War powers resolutions are coming, and defense funding is now part of the leverage calculus. And the appropriations process is once again being pulled into a fight it was never destined to absorb cleanly. That is why the shutdown threat persists. Not because Congress forgets the deadline, not because lawmakers don't understand the stakes, but because deadlines concentrate power. A shutdown threat forces conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. It drags unrelated priorities to the front of the line, and it allows politicians to frame themselves as fighters instead of administrators. That's why shutdown brinksmanship keeps returning. It works politically even when it fails operationally. Here's the structural problem, however. The Senate requires broad consent to move fast. The House can be stalled by a handful of members, and leadership on both sides has learned that crisis management is often easier than long-term governance. So instead of passing full-year funding on time, Congress relies on continuing resolutions, temporary patches, artificial cliffs. Each one creates a new moment of leverage, and each one normalizes dysfunction. And that normalization is the real risk here. Because shutdowns don't just delay services, they freeze hiring, they pause approvals, they stall contracts, and they inject uncertainty into everything from travel to small business operations to financial markets. And the more often that this happens, the more markets and institutions simply price it in. Dysfunction stops being shocking. In fact, it becomes expected. Now, leadership says a shutdown won't happen. They say progress is being made. They say cooler heads will prevail. And maybe they're right. But here's what actually determines the outcome. Not speeches, not Sunday shows, votes. So watch whether the minibus grows into real momentum or stalls under amendments. Watch whether healthcare gets stapled onto funding or peeled off to survive separately. Watch whether Senate leadership can actually move bills without unanimous consent, and watch whether House leadership can hold the floor without being held hostage. Because if any of those fail, the most likely outcome isn't a clean funding solution. It's another short-term patch, another punt, another cliff. What's my take on this? Well, this isn't a budgeting crisis, it's an incentive crisis. Congress keeps choosing deadlines over discipline because deadlines force action without forcing accountability. And until lawmakers pay a political price for temporary governance, this cycle won't break. And shutdown threats aren't accidents. They're features of a system that rewards brinksmanship more than boring competence. If you want to know whether this gets resolved, don't listen to reassurances. Watch for who's willing to vote for something imperfect and who benefits from keeping the clock running. Because in Washington, chaos isn't always failure. Sometimes it's a strategy, and that's what actually matters.